Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 2023, the year of the rabbit. We have, for the first time this year, we got Dr. David Salomon on. It's going to be a great show for those of you, and I don't know how many of you there are that may not know who Dr. David Salomon is, but I would be so thankful, Dr. Salomon, if you'd be so kind as just to maybe refresh people's memories about what you got going on, who you are, and what you've been up to.
Sure. So I have been a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature, religion, and culture for about 30 years. I'm currently the director of undergraduate research and creative activity at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. Native New Yorker, born and raised, um, and written a bunch of books. My most recent book is a book on the seven deadly sins, which I'm really quite proud of that work. So I hope people will take a look.
Yeah, it's a great book. And for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. David Solomon's books, they are very rewarding. There's tons of footnotes and everything is well researched. And I think that those who have seen previous podcasts have an understanding for his experience. And if you haven't, then you are in for a treat in this particular episode. He also writes a blog that is very fun and informative to read, of which I wanted to start off this episode with a little segment from your blog, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it if that's okay. Just a
Sure.
little piece here. It starts off in the middle of the blog, and it's corresponding to the perversion of art. And it says, Tolstoy, what is art? Question mark. Supplanting of the ideal of what is right by the ideal of what is beautiful, i.e., of what is pleasant. That is the fourth consequence, and a terrible one, of the perversion of art in our society. It is fearful to think of what would befall humanity were such art to spread among the masses of the people. And it already begins to spread. Blah, blew up my mind there a little bit. Like, can you just maybe kind of pan out a little bit and then bring us into what does that mean? And what are you thinking about when you wrote
Sure.
that?
Yeah. So let's back up. So we're talking about
Okay.
Leo Tolstoy, author most people know of War and Peace. I did not write what you just read. I wish I had. He did.
Oh,
Um,
sorry.
no,
I
that's
have my
fine.
notes messed up.
In a book called "What Is Art," um, and he's talking about a book which had been published already, a book published in 1896 called "Might Is Right." It was a book on survival of the fittest. Basically, it was kind of reacting to Darwin. And what Tolstoy is talking about is he's addressing that question: what is art? And let me read the
Yeah.
quote again. So he's describing the book "Might Is Right," this guy's book, as supplanting of the ideal of what is right by the ideal of what is beautiful, that is, of what is pleasant. That is the fourth consequence, and a terrible one, of the perversion of art in our society. So he's talking about, looking at, instead, this conflict has been going on since Plato, right? About, what is beauty, what is art? Is it just something that is pleasant and it makes me happy? Does it have some kind of intrinsic value? Is there a difference between beauty and something that's beautiful and something that is entertaining? We think today in terms of a lot of pop culture entertainment, right? I mean, the Marvel movies, they're very entertaining,
Yeah.
right? I'm not sure anybody would describe them as beautiful in the sense that Plato would use that term. Whereas if you're watching a film like, oh, I don't know, I'm trying to think about one off the top of my head, and the only one that came to mind immediately was Life is Beautiful, the Holocaust film, right? Which, I mean, it's, yes, it's entertaining, but there has an intrinsic kind of beauty to it and to the story. And I think what Tolstoy is talking about, and he continues in that quote, he says, it's fearful to think of what would befall humanity were such art to spread among the masses of the people. And it already begins to spread. And so we're talking about the ways in which we view art and what we view as art in our world. And, it's timely because I just took a trip before the holidays with my family, and we went up to New York City and up to Boston and also to Philadelphia. It was basically to look at museums, and went from one museum to another. And we were everywhere from the Metropolitan Museum of Art to the Mutter Museum of medical kind of oddities in Philadelphia. And it really begs that question about the connection between entertainment and art, I think. And that's something that people talk about a lot, especially when it comes to things like film, music, TV, right? Even literature, right? Even publishing. We've always kind of separated, pop lit, the kind of stuff that we stereotypically used to say you could buy at an airport bookstore, from literature, whatever that means. That kind of all got turned upside down many years ago when Toni Morrison became so popular and eventually won the Nobel Prize. Well, I mean, they were selling her books in the airport bookstore. Does that mean that she's not literature? That it's just pop writing, pop fiction? There are some bookstores that you go into that still separate out literature from fiction. How do they make that distinction? What does that mean?
It's a great question, and it's one of those questions that brings up more questions about this idea of how we interpret what is art, and what effect does it have? Like, does popular culture, is that what is pushing art in a direction, or is it art pushing on popular culture? There seems to be an interesting relationship there. Like, what do you think some of the dynamics there are?
Well, it's a relationship that I think has really shifted with technology and social
Yeah.
media and the internet. My students always marvel at the fact that I tell them that Robert Frost was on the cover of Life magazine in the very early 1960s. I mean, these guys were these literature. I mean, T.S. Eliot was on the cover of Time magazine. These literary figures were also pop figures in some ways before we even referred to them that way. We don't necessarily see that today. We separate, I think, and I'm not saying this to sound elitist, but philosophers talk about high art and low art, right? And high art being, you're looking at a Degas, and low art being, some would say things like Banksy,
Yeah.
when it comes to art, right? I mean, I don't know that I don't know. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think that it's a valid discussion that, quite honestly, we've been having as human beings for centuries. So when Tolstoy, sort of boldly names his little book "What is Art," I don't think he comes up with a good response. I think he comes up with he doesn't come up with the response. He comes up with a response for his time and place, and I think that's all we can do, because really what art is in transience constantly. It has to be. It has to be. I mean, when the Impressionists first came out, people thought that was garbage.
Hmm.
I mean, the initial assessment of that work was that's worthless. It's not art. And now it's hanging in museums around the world. And that's certainly some of that speaks to what we value. We talked about worth
Right.
the last time we talked, right?
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, has to do with that, but I think it's more than that. It speaks to this question of what do we get out of it.
Hmm.
And I think I've told you this story before, George, so forgive me. But when I was teaching in South Dakota, it was my first full-time teaching job after my PhD. I was teaching a seminar on aesthetics. So aesthetics, the philosophical study of beauty, basically. And my parents came out to visit. My father had never seen me teach. And I should preface this by saying and repeating, I mean, I grew up in New York City. My father loved the Impressionists. My father was high school educated, but we had a membership to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Every Sunday we would go down there. But basically, I mean, it was just the Impressionists that he was interested in. He was very interested in them. He read about them, and he just wanted to look at the Impressionists. So, and Van Gogh and Gauguin were two of his favorites. So when he came out to visit me, and he was going to sit in on my class, my seminar in aesthetics, I intentionally scheduled that day a critique session, which we had scheduled throughout the semester, where I would put up a piece on the screen and students would critique it from the perspective of the philosophers and the theorists that we had been studying. And so that day, I chose to put up a Van Gogh piece. I forget which one it was, because my father was going to be in class, and I thought he would really appreciate that. So I put up this Van Gogh painting, and the class critiqued it for about 45, 50 minutes. And after class, I said to my father, so, what did you think? And he said, well, I don't really understand. And I said, well, what don't you understand? He says, why can't you just say, that's a pretty picture? And I said, you can, but when we're talking about aesthetics, it's a pretty picture because, you can't leave that off. But he's happy enough just to be able to say, it's a pretty picture, I like it, and not have to defend why. Right. And I think that one of the differences that we sort of look at in our culture between what I'll call high art and low art is, I mean, high art has more depth to it, there's more oomph, whereas low art, you can say it's a pretty picture. You can go to a Marvel movie and say, I liked it, it was enjoyable, it had a lot of action. You're not going to do that if you go see a Bergman film, right? I mean, you're going to talk about it in a different context. And I think there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. I think what Tolstoy was afraid of and warning is that the what he calls the masses of the people, right? Eventually, what we now call pop culture would overtake that art world, and as a result, the whole idea of what is high art would kind of go out the window, because it would all be what speaks to the lowest common denominator, if you will. I mean, again, not to belabor it, but that Marvel movies are incredibly popular. They make a lot of money. A lot of people go see them. Is that art? I don't know. It's a type of art, but I don't think you can compare it with, say the films of Fellini or Bergman, or the films of some of these filmmakers who are working just on a different kind of level.
Yeah, I think it speaks volumes of the world we live in when we're surrounded by the type of things we call art. And it would be the things like the Marvel movies. And it's unfortunate to me that in today's world, some of the greatest artists are people that are in the advertisement industry. And
Yeah.
they're using their entire world view to paint pictures to get people to consume rather than to contemplate. And I think that the difference between contemplation and consumption is something that art could be beautiful for, but it's been the world of contemplation has been consumed by materialism in a weird sort of way. Like I look at some of these ads, and if you think of like in Hawaii, we're really blessed because we don't have huge billboards. We don't have advertisements everywhere. But we do have on the buildings, like a lot of artists will paint these beautiful pictures on the side of buildings. And it's so inspiring and it's amazing. And it makes me think to myself the effect it has on me. Like I'm not having this constant reaching out or grabbing me or asking me to buy this, or these constant bombardments thrown at me, whether I'm driving or walking. But I do have these beautiful images of a sunset or some dolphins or a beautiful woman that's staring at you, and there's this symbolism around them, and you're like, what does that mean? And you look at some of these billboards.
I mean, there can be something that's really beautiful about some advertising, though. I mean, you look at some older advertising, which I'm a fan of, looking at old print ads and things like that. Yeah. I mean, the artistry in them is just incredible. I mean, and a lot of the greatest artists of the 20th century started out working in advertising, doing print ads and drawing things like that. And the design world is the same way. If we look at the way things that are designed, trying to see. Yes, it is over on my shelf. I'm going to excuse myself for
Yeah,
1 second and
please.
grab this.
Please. I would love to see it.
So years ago, I found this somewhere. Someone was throwing it out. Yeah, it was when I was teaching in South Dakota, because that's the label that's on it. And I grabbed it, and it is an old, what's the brand here? Acer. I've never even heard of them. Acer stapler. And I just
That's
thought this has
beautiful.
such interesting lines
Yeah.
to it. It's an interesting design, right? I mean, it has function, but the form of it is also kind of beautiful.
Yeah, I agree.
And if you take that versus the stapler that's sitting on my desk, that's not very pretty. It's functional, but it isn't something that I don't think years from now I'm going to keep and put on my shelf,
Yeah.
right? So the shift that we've seen in that sort of melding together of form and function is interesting, right? Things have become so much
Yes.
more functional, and the form of them, in many ways, not that important, not as important. As I say, I was just in New York City, and a lot of people are decrying a lot of the new buildings that are going up because they're just ugly. The form of them is just not very attractive. They're very functional. They will do what they need to do. But as buildings, when you compare them to, say, the Art Deco buildings of the 20s and 30s, many of which are still standing in the city, you can't even compare them. It was interesting. We were walking down 42nd Street towards the New York Public Library, and between 5th and 6th Avenue, in the sidewalk, they have put these plaques that have quotes from writers on them. So as you're walking along to the library, you see this. Now, I don't know what year those were put into the sidewalks. I don't think it was that long ago, but a very interesting idea that adds a kind of form. I mean, this is a functional thing. You're walking on the sidewalk. Who cares what it looks like? And the fact of the matter is, there were days when people did care what it looked like. I mean, like you're talking about the murals on the sides of buildings.
Yeah.
We saw
Yeah.
some of those in Philadelphia too. I was really struck by it on the sides of some buildings. Some of these beautiful murals that had been painted, and these were new, not old. And I think there's an interesting thing. You've got the function of the building, but it doesn't mean that there can't be something to it, right? And I think in many ways we've gravitated away from that and think about just, well, is it functional? Is it functional? That's what's important. I mean, as I look around here on my desk, my desk things they're all functional. There's nothing. I mean, there's nothing very attractive about any of it. It serves a function. And in our disposable society, when it's finished its function, it'll be thrown away. And I think that it speaks to the resurgence recently in people interested in everything vintage.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I put that word in quotation marks because, boy, it's taken a battering. If you go onto eBay and type in vintage, you'll see what people are considering vintage. It's kind of funny. But if you look at some of these things, that they're beautiful. I bought something this morning from a gentleman. I teach a museum studies course, starts next week, and it's curating. So my students will curate an exhibition. Hopefully later in the semester, when we're done, we can have some of them on the show.
I would love it.
And one of the things, so this semester they're going to do two different sort of parts of the show. One will be focused on things that are related to ritual, and the other thing will be focused on things that are related to play. And so I bought this morning a little children's desk from a gentleman that it's hard to describe, but it has a chalkboard on it that you open, and then inside were these pegs with a mallet that you pound in the pegs into, so you can learn how to do that. And I bought it from him, and he said, I don't know how old it is. He says, I would say 68 or 69 years old. He said, I'm 73. I guess I never used it. It was his. And it still had everything intact. But it just it has an intrinsic beauty to the design of the thing that I don't think you're going to find if you go to find something similar in Walmart today in the toy section. There was a craftsmanship, and we talked about this once before,
Yeah.
right? Artisanship and craftsmanship, which just seems to be in many ways waning in the shadows of mass production and making everything as cheap as you can. I've never looked. I'm sure if I go on eBay, I'll bet you the stapler's up there. And I can only imagine what someone is selling it for. I have no idea what year it's from because there's some tape and stuff on the bottom of it, but I think people are more and more interested in these vintage items. They lasted, but more than that, they had some beauty to them.
Yeah, I agree. Is it heavy? It looks like it's pretty solid.
Very heavy. You could kill somebody with this. you could write a really good murder mystery where somebody's killed with this stapler.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Looking online, yep, and on eBay, sure enough, there they are, one after another. Not worth much, it seems. People have them up for $15, $20, but they see that there is something about this that meant you wanted to keep it. I don't know what year it's from. I'm trying to see here. So it's Acer model 502. Oh, that's funny. So it's Acer was the name of the staple company. Now when you put in Acer to Google, you get Acer, the computer company.
Yep. Yeah.
That interesting.
It is interesting. It blows me away too. I got sort of mesmerized by the idea of writers' quotes on the sidewalk, and it made me think about how we could be surrounded by all kinds of artwork and what that might do to our society. I'm wondering if there's a relationship between these bland buildings and these bland jobs and these bland ideas. Like, it seems that even though these things, if I went to a home builder that's building commercial buildings and I had mentioned to them, why don't you think we should be incorporating art? They would probably want to do a cost basis or a cost-effective analysis.
Yeah.
But people don't tend to factor in the long-term effects of artwork on someone's creative abilities later in life. I think they should, right?
Well, and we're seeing that though. I mean, you say, about having it around us. I mean, for a while, there was I don't think the program is still going on, but there was a program to get poetry into the subways. A friend of mine wrote a book that collected all the poetry that had been put in subways. And out in California, I believe it was maybe San Francisco. I'm not positive. There was I think it was even Starbucks was starting to put quotes on cups, literary quotes. And I know a poet friend of mine, Marilyn Chin, she had one of her poems, a section of it was on a cup, and I remember she posted it on Facebook. But I just finished reading Susan Orlean's book, The Library.
Okay.
This is Susan Orlean's the author of The Orchid Thief. People may know her from that. And The Library was not her most recent book, but the one before that. And it is about the public library in Los Angeles, which had a terrible fire in the 1980s. And it was a really intriguing book. But she goes in the book to talking about when the library was built and all of the art that was just a part of the library, the sculpture and the relief work that was done on the ceilings and the paintings and the murals. As you say, I mean, we don't really see that much anymore. I think that has largely gone away as a result of just this focus on function.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have a formal background in art. I like to look at it and I like to read about it, but I know that you do have a lot more insight, with the work that you do as a creative director. You are around different types of artistic abilities and stuff. And I wanted to read this quote to you to get your, maybe you could help me understand it better, or I could at least get your opinion on it. So would it be okay if I read this for a moment?
Sure.
Hegel, who empathetically held on to the arts being meaningful, therefore limited the sensual in the arts to the two theoretical senses of sight and hearing. They alone have access to meaning, while smell and taste are excluded from the enjoyment of art. The latter are only susceptible to the agreeable, which is not the beauty of art. For smell, taste, and touch have to do with matter as such and its immediately sensible qualities. Smell and material volatility in air, taste with the material liquefaction of objects, touch with warmth, cold, smoothness, etc. The smooth only conveys an agreeable feeling which cannot be connected with any meaning or profound sense. It exhausts itself in a wow. But this idea that the theoretical senses of sight and hearing, and they alone have access to meaning, like that's a pretty deep thought. What do you think about that?
Well, it's Hegel. As soon as you said Hegel, I said, "Oh no," because it's a level of philosophical thought that most of us don't engage in, which is thinking about things like the senses and what they have access to. Although the Greeks were doing the same thing in some ways. I think there's some truth to that. I don't think it works on all levels, because I can sit down and have a really incredible meal and think, that chef is a real artist, right? Because that food just, the taste of it, the taste and the smell, which is what I'm engaging in, as well as the visual, has an artistic sensibility to it. But that being said, I'm a huge music fan, and listen to music really as a tonic in many cases, and always am just really kind of just marveling at the beauty of music. And I'm talking about everything from Mozart to Britney Spears, right? And I'm listening to everything, and just amazing. It's so funny, because I was listening to something this morning, and you're going to laugh, but it was a song by the Captain and Tennille. And initially people think Captain and Tennille is bubblegum music, right? It was pop music, 1970s, means nothing. But the fact of the matter is that the Captain, Daryl, I forget what his last name is, was actually an incredible sound engineer and producer. In fact, a lot of the greatest albums of the 1970s and 80s were recorded in his studio. So he was an incredible producer. But I was listening to this one song, and I was listening not to her singing. Her singing was beautiful, but the production value of it, the music, the way that he recorded this, and the way that it's layered, and it had such an incredible beauty. And I listened to that song over and over again, and I'm like, wow. I've heard that song for 50 years, and I've always just kind of tossed it aside as like, oh yeah, that was a top 40 hit, But you listen to it a little bit more closely, and you hear the beauty of it. So I think, the hearing and the seeing, certainly that's got something to do with it. But I think the other senses are engaged as well. I'm not gonna argue with Hegel, first because I couldn't, and second because I would never want to. But a Hegelian would have a whole discussion about this that would be beyond me, and I wouldn't understand what they were talking about. I can barely understand what Hegel's talking about.
Yeah, I'm with you. That's why I asked. I was like, I don't thoroughly understand. I kind of can see what he's saying, but sometimes the sense of smell and the sense of taste are derivatives of the sensual mood, or they seem sensual in a lot of ways to me. If we look at the future for a minute and we talk about technology like we always do, there's some really interesting art programs right now from artificial intelligence where you can type in exactly what you want, and it will put it in the style of pick your artist. You could have the David Salomon blog painted in the style of whoever. It's in. What do you think is? What do you see happening there? Is that going to explode art in ways for people, or is it going to make the base shrink a little bit? Or do you have any thoughts on it?
Because I've been discussing this with some artist friends of mine in the last couple of weeks, especially as this new AI bot has come out which seems to be really sort of rocking everybody's world. And there was an editorial in the Times, I think it was on Sunday or Monday, by an illustrator, and she put at the bottom of it a comic strip that she had drawn, and then she put in what the AI bot had given her when she put the same, the information in, and and she admitted, I mean, it was kind of close, I don't know, I've always kind of had myself a personal dislike of what's always been referred to as digital art. I didn't really understand what was going on there, because for me, art was a tactile thing, and I didn't really get how you could do that. And then a friend of mine, an old high school friend of mine, who's become a quite a successful painter. She lives in Europe at the moment, and she's quite amazing. And she still does paint traditionally on a canvas, but she also does a lot of painting, quote unquote, on her iPad. And when she told me this and showed me what she's able to do, it was kind of amazing, because initially I thought, as so many people think when they see abstract art, they're like, well, I could do that. And so I said to her, and I try to draw and paint. I'm no good, but I dabble in it as a really amateur. I don't know. You need to, like, amateur to the 10th power. I'm so far away from being anything that's any good. But I said to her, well, what program? She told me the program she was using was just a program that you downloaded. It didn't even cost anything. And so I downloaded the program and I started fooling it. I was like, oh my God. There is something to this. You just, not everybody could do it. And and here's the big but, because the traditionalist me comes out, right? If I'm at the museum looking at a painting, and I want to walk up to the painting and I'm looking at the brush strokes, I'm looking at the paint, I'm thinking about the artist having stood in that same spot and applying the paint to the canvas and what he or she went through. Or when I'm looking at, for example, Degas' sculpture of the dancer, of the ballet dancer, I'm looking at the work that goes into that, and the very subtlety of the legs. I'm not sure that the digital can reproduce that. And let me correct myself. It can reproduce it. I'm not sure it can create it. Right? It can clearly reproduce it. Can it create it? That's a different question, right? And that's when it comes with the artificial intelligence, the whole issue of the Turing test and the sentience of AI, right? I mean, can it create and not just mimic? I don't know. I mean, it's funny that you bring this up, because I was just reading this morning this article that was it was an interview with this woman. She's a computer scientist who won a prestigious MacArthur Genius Grant, and she does work on in the AI world. Her name is Ye-Jin Choi, and the interviewer asked her whether or not trying to find out where it is here. She's point blank asked her whether or not she thought whether or not artificial intelligence was going to be able to make moral decisions in the future. And her answer to that, so the question was, how could you possibly teach AI to make moral decisions when almost every rule or truth has exceptions? And her answer is, AI should learn exactly that. There are cases that are more clean cut, and then there are cases that are more discretionary. And example that she gave later on was an understanding just the little nuances of things that computers don't seem to be able to yet do, that require human interaction in order to understand that. She refers to it as the dark matter of intelligence.
Wow.
Which I thought was really interesting. And she uses birds as an example. She says, we don't talk about it, but everyone knows it. We don't know the exact fraction of knowledge, that you and I have that we didn't talk about, but my speculation is there's a lot. You and I know birds can fly, and we know penguins generally cannot. So AI researchers thought we can code this up. Birds usually fly, except for penguins. But in fact, exceptions are the challenge for common sense rules. Newborn baby birds cannot fly. Birds covered in oil cannot fly. Birds who are injured cannot fly. Birds in a cage cannot fly. The point being, exceptions are not exceptional. And you and I can think of them even though nobody told us. It's a fascinating capability, and it's not so easy for AI.
Man, so that makes me think that maybe, the
We were
perversion.
reading over my shelf this morning, my shoulder this morning, and
I think we're on the same wavelength. Like
apparently, yeah,
in,
synchronicity.
yeah, I think it's probably on a lot of people's minds. How can it not be? It's right in front of us. And it makes me come to this idea. Once you read that, and I looked at the title of our podcast today, is the perversion of art in our society. Maybe what's happening, and maybe this is the perversion, is that we are not so much teaching AI about what art can be, as much as AI is telling us what art cannot be. And that seems to be a perversion of art. That seems to be scary to me, like, because, we can't code that in. Well, how much longer before that's not even in our algorithm? And by algorithm, I mean our behavior. Like,
Right.
maybe it's the AI that is coding us, in a weird sort of way. That would be a
That's the
perversion
danger,
of art.
right? If we become
Yes.
slaves to it,
Yes. Yeah,
if
no
we
problem.
become slaves to it, then the AI will tell us what art is, right? And that's the danger, rather
Right.
than us understanding what art is. And then, well, can AI do that? Can it not do that? But if we shift the field here and say, well, AI is telling us that's not art, that's just crazy. I mean, I think we mentioned once before, I just find it funny that we are so obsessed with artificial intelligence when we still haven't figured out human intelligence.
Yeah, I know.
I think we still need a lot of work on human intelligence before we can do the AI. But there you go.
That gives me hope for it as a tool. Like, some of the beauty that I see coming from this AI world of art is the ability for people, the same way that we saw people come back from the Middle East and got these new limbs and they were able to walk again. I think that the AI may be almost a prosthetic for people who can't really draw but are very imaginative. And it may open up this new field. It may open up new collaborations for people who are very imaginative but can't quite translate that vision into reality. Maybe now they could work with an artist, and it could be a bridge that people walk across and help each other. So maybe there's something there.
It's looking at it from a collaborative perspective.
Yes.
And thinking more of what can we do that to make this a hybrid, right? It can hybridize what we mean by art. And I think about people like Laurie Anderson, the performance artist, who, I mean, she's amazing, and she's done incredible things throughout her career with technology, just incredible things with technology. But she still also paints.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a really fine painter, and she, in her work, oftentimes integrates both of them together, right? The technology and the traditional arts, the way that we think about it. And I think that's where you can get to some really interesting things. Several years ago, she was the first, and she says the only guest artist for NASA. They brought her on board as a guest. I forget what the term they used for the title. It was guest artist, something like that. Mm-hmm. And she argues that the whole thing was such a disaster they're never going to have another one, because they had different expectations of what she was going to do from what she did. But she did some really interesting things when she was working with them. And if you check Laurie Anderson's website online, you can see some of this stuff.
Yeah.
She's had a retrospective of her work has been going on at the Smithsonian. I think it's still up, but probably closing soon. It's really quite a fine show in DC.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at that. It makes me curious to see those two things working together. It's fascinating me to think also how, it seems, and maybe for good reason, but it seems the the wall to get into the world of art is sometimes a high wall to climb, and maybe this AI kind of brings that wall down or lowers. And
Right.
I don't know if you want to lower the barrier to entry because you want to have great artists there, but maybe it allows a different entrance or something to that effect, where there's probably a lot of brilliant artists out there that have just never had the opportunity to be
Sure.
surrounded.
Well, I mean, it's the whole question of democratization, right?
Mm,
You're saying it will democratize art, right? The same way that, for example, self-publishing is democratized
yes,
writing,
that's a
right?
good point.
And yeah, maybe that's true. I mean, we've always had as part of the culture what we've referred to as sort of folk artists, right?
Hmm.
I mean, these sort of local artists that just, you know, that they make these things or they paint these things, and it exists and it sort of operates on a particular level that doesn't again reach the level of say something that's going to go in the Met.
Right.
Um, but more and more people are becoming interested in that kind of art, you know, outsider art and things like that, and more um, ethnically derived art, right? Looking at things like that, it's very interesting. It has an intrinsic value in and of itself. And again, it's we're not going to compare it because it's comparing apples and oranges, right? I'm not
Yeah.
going to put a piece of this outsider art up next to, you know, Da Vinci's Salvator Mundi. I mean, that would be crazy. They're not the same thing. The same way that I'm not going to have, you know, a kid playing t-ball go in and pinch hit for the Yankees. It's just that would be crazy. And so, you know, too often I think that we just have this sort of static sort of idea of what the thing is. It's like, well, it doesn't reach that, so it's not that, and so get it out of here because it doesn't cut the mustard. Um, uh, Probably not a good way to go. I mean, you know, I mean, look at how democratized the airways have gotten, right? I mean,
Yeah,
25 years ago, I mean, you and I could have never done something like this,
that's right.
but the internet allowed it to happen.
Yeah,
Uh,
it is
Brought that democratization.
I like that. You know, it's curious, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. As you know, when we look at the world of museums, and you're around it so much, and you get to influence it, and you've been
I don't know
around,
about
you've
that, but
traveled
I
around. Well, like, what are there some trends that you see, like when you look at the world of art and you've traveled and you've seen some great pieces, and now you're getting to see great pieces in the students that are looking to curate pieces? Like,
yeah.
do you see some changes in there, or can you almost look in your crystal ball and see, like, I see these new kids coming up that have this factor, and like, what are some of the things that are the same, and what are some things that you think are different about the new people coming up through the world of art?
There's an interesting blend because I mean the students that I see who are engaged in the studio arts, and even the students who are interested in art history, are interested in a very fine blending of the traditional with the avant-garde and the cutting edge, and I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
You know, they're just as interested in looking at you know the Dutch masters and really understanding what they're all about as they are looking at contemporary artists who are really on the cutting edge today. Many of whom, I mean, you know, we wouldn't have heard of yet
Yeah.
unless we traveled in those circles. I think that that's a really great thing. I think that's important. I think it's important in just about any field, but in the art world especially, and in you know in that world, I'm including music and literature, and not just visual art, performing art for that matter as well. But thinking about, you know, you can't know where you're going till you know where you've been, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, I always think it's interesting when you get students who are majoring in English literature, they're like, I don't want to take a course in Shakespeare. What do I need that for? It's like, well, because he's foundational in English literature. You know, you may not like him. I don't like Jane Austen, right? But I still do. I understand that she has a place in the history of English literature that's important. And my fear is that we are dismissing a lot of what we've always thought of as seminal artists, seminal figures, and most often they're being pushed to the side in the name of diversity and saying, well, you know, they're all dead white guys, right? Who
Yeah.
cares? But they set the stage for today, and you know, I think we can look at them. You know, we can run the danger of looking at them through that presentist bias,
Yes, without a
right?
doubt.
Which is, you know, oh well, you know, if you look at Freud, I mean, you know, he was a pervert. I mean, you know, come on, what's going on there? And he took drugs. Yeah, from 2022, valid assessment,
Right,
right?
right.
But we still have to appreciate and understand him for what he did and what he said, because without it, it's that house of cards, right? I mean, he's got the bottom level. You take that out, the whole thing's going to collapse. My daughter is majoring in anthropology, and we've been talking about, you know, the problem of Margaret Mead. I mean, foundational anthropologist, incredibly important, but also very difficult given today's world because of a lot of what she said and did and wrote. It's troubling in looking at it through the lens of 2022. That doesn't mean we should dismiss it. It means we have to understand it in its context.
Yeah, it's like the founding fathers, give me liberty or give me death, except for these slaves over here. You know,
Exactly.
it's a but to deny that would be to deny our progress, to deny what happened there and look on it and apply the 2023 standards to that. Is you can't get lost in that. Like you said, you can't get lost in applying today's standard to that. Like that's a pivotal, and there's good and bad about it. And that's the beauty of it, is like, look, yes, and yes, look at that. That's, don't not look at it, like embrace it and hold it. You know, I'm
Sure. I
curious
mean,
to get
there are things that you see in art, you know, looking at visual art that you go back and look at, that you say, oh my God, you know, that's really pretty racist, you know?
Sure.
And you're like, yeah, it is. You know, did the artist know it when he was painting it? No. You know, it was a different world and a different context. I'm not excusing it. I'm not saying it's okay. I'm acknowledging it for what it is and understanding that looking at it with today's eye, it's troubling. But it doesn't mean we get rid of it.
Right.
You know, it has a place somewhere. And, you know, so, you know, some listeners will say, well, you know, now I've raised a problem because, well, what about things like the Confederate monuments, right? Which, you know, I mean, I live in Virginia. It's a real thing here, right? Yeah. You know, I mean, my view of the whole thing is they shouldn't be in public. Do they have a place somewhere? Probably. In a museum, in somebody's private collection. They need to be taken off of public display because they're inappropriate for what they are. That doesn't mean that we should get rid of them. We should destroy them. You know, wouldn't it be nice to have all those Beatle records that were destroyed after John Lennon said that they were bigger than God, you know?
Yeah, I often wonder too, like, you know, when you get rid of a monument or you get rid of a statue, in some ways you're paving the way for it to happen again. Like it can be it can be a reminder of a lot of things. It can be a reminder of this is horrible, or it can be a reminder of let's keep this here so it never happens again. Let's teach people this.
Well, it has to. Well, it gets into the discussion. We have this discussion in the museum studies world. The difference between a memorial and a monument.
Ooh, that's
right.
good.
And they're two different things, right? A memorial is let's always remember this. Right? A monument is wasn't this a wonderful, great thing? We're going to put up a monument to it. Two different things. Now, a lot of these Confederate monuments are monuments. And just recently, within the last couple of weeks, they announced that in Roanoke, Virginia, they are actually taking down the statue that they have of Robert E. Lee, and it's being replaced with a statue of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks is the woman whose genes
cured cancer.
Cancer cells were used.
Yeah.
And really wonderful book written about it. And Roanoke is where she's from, and her family still lives there.
Oh, wow.
So they're taking down the Robert E. Lee statue and putting up a statue of Henrietta Lacks. Like, well, there's a big change.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting to see society change in a way. Maybe her family should be getting a residual income from the pharmaceutical companies instead of a monument. But
There's been a lot of court cases and controversy about that. In fact, a couple of years ago, I tried to get the author of the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, to come to campus to speak. And her agent said that she will only come if you will also pay for members of the family to come with her to tell the story, which I thought was really interesting.
That is. That makes I want to shift gears for a moment. I know we're coming up on close to our time, but I had read a little bit about Ivy League schools, and in particular, my friend and I were talking about Harvard and their business side of Harvard, and there's all these businesses that kind of spin out of there, and it seems like an interesting model, and I'm wondering if that's maybe something that could be applied to more schools, even grade schools, or even Christopher Newport. If you guys do anything like this, where wouldn't it be beautiful if the students could come in and they could be almost nurtured in a way where they come up with a piece of art, or even in a public school, kids today, let's take it to a whole nother level. Like, why couldn't schools today, like a fifth grader or a third grader, why couldn't they be creating works of art and be pairing with museums or be pairing with something, and they could get a residual income out of it? The school could get some and they could get some.
Yep.
Is that a way that schools could be changing?
And some have started to do that. There's a museum that a former student of mine runs in Wisconsin, and she has a section of the museum actually set aside for kids to come in, and they make art, and then they put it up. It's kind of a rotating exhibit.
Right.
I'm not sure if there's any monetary residual from any of that, but it encourages kids to engage in the arts. And it's probably not a good thing to make it connected to finance, because it would just reinforce the idea of art as commerce.
Right. That's a good point.
But a lot more of that kind of thing is happening. I mean, I have students here who go into the elementary schools in Newport News and work with kids on art projects. Especially as of course art teachers are being eliminated.
Yeah.
Art and music especially is being hard hit, and so the kids do need that kind of outlet. It's important for them to be able to do that. So I think it would be interesting to collaborate with museums, and I think more and more of them are doing that with kids. I was in so many museums when we went on our trip. I can't even remember some of them at this point, but I was in one of them, and they did have a section set aside where it was kids art again that they posted. And I think that's a really important part of what we do in nurturing the creativity of kids. Something that we have gotten really lax on, but something that sadly in most people gets matured out of them, right? I mean, as you get older, it's just finger painting is something you did when you were a child.
Yeah, it's sad to see that this world that is open to them at a very early age, all of a sudden the walls come shutting down on them by the age of fourth grade and fifth grade, and there's either no budget for it, or there's no creative director or an art teacher that can actually spend time with the kids and develop those skills.
But it also speaks to the value that we place on it as a culture, right? Again, it's kind of a form and function thing. Looking at a fourth grader making art, it's like, well, that's not going to get you anywhere. Learn this math, right? Because this is what you're going to need. And so we've shifted so much in our country from education as really a formative process to looking at it as job training, which is just horrific. It really is, and we've seen it in higher ed as well, right? I mean, people come to college to get a degree, to get a credential, so they can get a job, and it's not about getting an education. I used to have a sign on my door. I don't think it's still there for many years it said, don't just get a degree, get an education.
It's true.
And that's a tough sell, though, especially in this day and age when the cost of education is just so damn high. And I'll defend myself by saying it's not going into salaries. It is not. It is not. I mean, on most college campuses and even public school systems, the highest outlay in the budget is physical plant and keeping up physical plant. That's what the money is being spent on. It's buildings that are falling apart.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's so much we can do as people, as creative directors or fathers or truck drivers, or, I want to share a quick story. I came from this. I used to live in Southern California, and I was born in North San Diego. And there's this little town where it was called Cardiff. And in Cardiff, they had commissioned this world-renowned artist to build. It's a big surf town. And they had commissioned this artist to do a sculpture of a guy surfing, and everyone was so excited. It was going to be so cool. And it was kept kind of under wraps. And this guy he was a brilliant artist. I forgot his name. And the sculpture that he made, like they called it it was like Learn to Surf. And it was a picture of this guy surfing. And the sculpture was beautiful. It was the face was immaculate, and the hair and the detail. The problem was, the guy looked like a total kook, and he was standing on the board all weird. And they dubbed him the Cardiff Kook, and everyone was they were so upset. They were like, "That's not us, man. It's a beautiful sculpture, but the guy looks like a kook, man." And so one night, about a week or 3 weeks in, some local artists went down there and they made this giant paper mache shark, and they put it over the Carlsbad Kook, and the city got so upset, and everyone woke up and they went down and they were laughing. But it turned into this thing where, okay, once a month, a new artist would come down, and they wouldn't wreck the statue, but they would accent it. And it became this whole world of artists that would come down and be like, I'm going to do this. And everyone would outdo the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just thought to myself, like, what a great way to teach rebellion. What a great way to teach art. And what a great way to amplify the message. And you had all these artists coming down. I can't believe you would deface it. I didn't deface it. I made it better. And, it just became this beautiful group of artists that would go and have this conversation and have this artwork. And it was a beautiful way. And I think that's just an example of a way communities can teach kids art, and they can teach you how to get a message across, how to say, I don't like this without defacing something, and how to start a conversation, and how to use art to amplify other art. And I think that that's something that could be done in all communities around. You don't have to deface anything, or you don't have to send a message. There's a better way, and you could get together and communicate and collaborate. And
to have the discussion of, as you're saying, but it's not enough to say, I don't like it. Right. I don't like it because, right?
Yes.
Why don't you like it? What's wrong?
Yeah.
Right? And how could it be improved? What does that mean about art? What does it mean about what this piece is supposed, to have that discussion? Whereas if you just say, I don't like it, it just shuts down the conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, there was kids sitting Indian style, eating popcorn, listening to people talk about things, and it was like, that is how it's done right there. And it was a beautiful sculpture, but just not the way people wanted to be remembered and stuff. So I think that there's, for everybody listening out there, if you're a fan of art and you're a fan of sculpture, there's so many ways you can improve the community and get your kids to be part of it, and get your neighbors to be part of it, and the businesses around you to be part of it. And, I often think, like, when you're driving on the freeway and there's all this just concrete everywhere, like, wouldn't it be great if we could get kids from schools to come and paint their ideas of what's happening in the world? And it'd be like driving down this interstate of beautiful artwork, and I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways we can make the world better.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point.
So, but before as we're landing the plane here, Dr. Salomon, what do you got coming up? Where can people find you, and what are you excited about?
Yeah. Well, my website is David A. Salomon. It's SALOMON.com. And links to my books and the blog and media appearances and my consulting. Everything's up on there. Coming up, excited. We begin classes on Monday here, so I'm excited about a new semester and this class on curating, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. Busy semester coming up for me with work, and working on some more writing and trying to get some things done, which isn't always easy, but working on it. And just excited about the fact that it's a new year. And I don't know about where you are, George, but here I am in coastal Virginia today, and I think it's 74 degrees at the moment, which is insane. Oh, it's crazy though. It's crazy. I'm just looking to see here. It's 68 degrees at the moment. It should be about 50. So it's very interesting weather that we're having.
It is. What can you give us a hint on what the new blog is going to be about?
No, because I'm working on some ideas. Actually, I was reading a lot about artificial intelligence this morning, which is why that came up. And it may deal with that.
Okay, I'll be looking for it. And it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I'm really thankful you can take time to come and hang out with me in the audience. It's fun. So
appreciate being on.
Yeah, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Go check out the blog. Check out Dr. David Salomon. Definitely get the book 7 Deadly Sins. It's well worth your time, and you'll be a better person because you read it. So I love it. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great afternoon, and we'll be back next week. Thank you for your time. Aloha.